My pet country is Equatorial Guinea. The only Spanish-speaking country in Africa, is defined as a small West African nation with a high GDP yet extreme poverty. Located on Africa's western coast bordering the Atlantic Ocean, it covers 28,000 square kilometers with a population of approximately 1.42 million. Uniquely, its capital Malabo is situated on Bioko Island, 16.5 kilometers offshore from the mainland. Inheriting colonial-era infrastructure, the island exhibits significantly higher development levels in healthcare, education, and wealth compared to the mainland. After World War II, Spain continued to be ruled by Franco, who sought to preserve the legacy of the Spanish colonial empire. However, the post-war global wave of national independence made it impossible for Spain to remain unaffected. By the 1960s, Spain realized it could no longer retain Equatorial Guinea and that its independence was inevitable. Franco thus began searching for a proxy, a puppet president who could safeguard Spanish interests after independence. Franco believed this proxy needed to meet two criteria: loyalty to Spain and sheer stupidity. History proved that while Macias Nguema failed the first criterion, he overwhelmingly satisfied the second. Macias was born in 1924 in Mongomo, Equatorial Guinea, into a relatively affluent family that enabled him to complete primary and secondary education. In 1944, he joined the Spanish colonial government but performed so poorly that he resigned 3 years later to grow coffee. In 1951, he re-entered the colonial bureaucracy as a low-level civil servant. After a decade of mediocrity, his luck changed. As mentioned earlier, the Spanish needed a loyal yet incompetent puppet, and Macias fit both traits perfectly. Despite being black, Macias harbored an obsessive admiration for Franco. His loyalty caught Spain's attention, and after 10 years in government, he finally began rising through the ranks. In 1963, Macias personally traveled to Spain to celebrate Franco's 25th year in power, earning Franco's praise and designation as Spain's chosen proxy for Equatorial Guinea. In 1963, Equatorial Guinea gained autonomous status. By 1964, Macias was appointed Deputy Prime Minister. When the country formally declared independence in 1968, Spanish interference ensured Macias's electoral victory, making him the first president of Equatorial Guinea, concurrently serving as Commander-in-Chief and Defense Minister. The 20th century saw countless absurd African leaders, tyrants, incompetents, and corrupt officials, but none fit all these labels as seamlessly as Macias. Years later, the most common descriptor for him would be a madman. Initially perceived as a figure of African anti-colonialism, Macias had disguised himself well during colonial rule. Yet once in power, he immediately turned against his patrons. Just 1 month after his election, he launched a full-scale expulsion of Spaniards, inciting youth-led chaos. Spain had maintained a long-standing presence in Equatorial Guinea, with over 7,000 residents, mostly teachers, technicians, merchants, and administrators, in a nation of just 300,000 people. Their expulsion devastated the country's social fabric. Equatorial Guinea was a purely agrarian and underdeveloped economy, reliant on cocoa and coffee plantations managed by Spanish landowners and Nigerian laborists. With the Spaniards expelled, Macias's government proved incapable of managing these operations, prompting Nigerian workers to flee en masse. Within years, the nation's sole industry collapsed, plantations lay abandoned, and by 1981, coffee production had plummeted by 78% and cocoa by 98%, triggering total economic collapse. Public discontent surged, but Macias silenced dissent by banning all media, systematically exiling or executing intellectuals. Opposition within the government was met with summary executions. He abolished media, courts, schools, and even the teaching profession. With nearly all functional departments dismantled, Macias's regime operated through only 3 institutions: the military, police, and prisons. Diplomats dubbed his Equatorial Guinea the Auschwitz of Africa. This deranged regime was ultimately toppled in 1979 by Macias's nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbosogo. Though far from a capable leader, Obiang oversaw rising GDP and has remained president through sham elections to this day. But how did this absurd agricultural regime achieve GDP levels rivaling developed nations? Divine intervention, perhaps. In the 1990s, over 5 billion barrels of oil were discovered in Equatorial Guinea's waters. Lacking extraction technology, the nation leased drilling rights to foreign firms, retaining less than 20% of profits. Still, this boosted per capita GDP to $23,000 by 2008, on par with wealthy nations. Even after oil price fluctuations and dwindling reserves, per capita GDP stayed above $10,000 until 2015 and remains around $7,000 today. However, oil wealth never reached ordinary citizens. The elite reside on the idyllic island of Bioko, while mainlanders endure poverty, hunger, and disease. Over 75% live in destitution, yet the GDP facade reduces international aid, leaving many worse off than pre-oil times. The regime faces no rebellion threat. The elite are isolated on the island, protected by a navy, 2 frigates, 5 patrol boats, second only to Nigeria in West Africa, that blocks mainlanders from approaching. Though Obiang pardoned political prisoners post-coup, dissent remains criminalized, with returnees imprisoned. Under international pressure, he instituted a nominal democracy, but power stays monopolized by his family. After criticism of human rights abuses in 1993, American oil firms' interest in Equatorial Guinea's reserves warmed relations. The U backed Obiang's re-election, and he granted drilling rights to U companies, surrendering most oil revenue while skimming the remainder for himself and allies. Infrastructure stagnated, citizens saw no benefits, and the nation became a high GDP slum. A paradox of oil wealth and mass impoverishment. I propose targeting public-private partnerships, PPPs, in construction sectors, leveraging Equatorial Guinea's urgent need for modern urban frameworks. By aligning with local elites' developmental rhetoric and securing guarantees through oil revenue escrow accounts, foreign firms could navigate the opaque regulatory environment while profiting from one of Africa's last untapped infrastructure frontiers.